Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 5.06, and in this lesson, I'm going to quickly talk about my e-kick creation. So this video is going to follow a little bit of a different logic than the past videos where we go in and recap and look at my projects, mainly because this was the first creation project and my first time working in Bitwig where I actually went through all of the steps, all of the stages to making a full composition. So I even added a mastering chain at the very end of this process. So we're not going to listen to the full track. It's 12 minutes in length. If you want to listen to it, I'll include the link below. But basically what I want to do is try to help you out in working through creating something from scratch when there's so many possibilities available to you. So in this case, we had the e-kick as our sound source, and then we had every other effect processor, container, modulator, effects tracks, etc., that we've covered in the past sections and past videos. And right away, I realized how big of a mistake I had made by giving you this creation project at this point, because there are just way too many choices. So maybe you tried to sit down and start doing this and got into trouble. That would make complete sense to me, because if you're not experienced and familiar with working from scratch with so many choices, you're going to get into trouble. And the first thing I did when I started to work on this was limit myself. So I said, okay, the only modulator device I'm going to use is the LFO. I also told myself right off the bat, I am not going to use the FX4. That is going to get things way too crazy on top of a project that's already super crazy. And I gave myself a variety of other parameters, and I kind of said, okay, what am I going to try to make? Well, I know I can resample reverb tails, and by resampling reverb tails, I know I can kind of come up with a soundscape. So that, my mind is going and going and going. And already some of you are probably lost and confused. Like, why is he making those decisions? Why is he making those choices? And that's what I'm going to try to explain in this video. So as I just mentioned, there were some issues with this particular assignment. The first and hardest question is, how am I supposed to start this? And that would be a very logical question to ask. And even if you do start, you might run into a situation where you just feel like you have so many choices and you get a bit overwhelmed. Don't worry, in our future creation challenges, we're going to impart some stricter rules, which I hope will help you to create, which I hope will help you to get into the software and actually do something, because that's what this is really all about. I'm also going to start adding in another element, which is time. And it's something we've yet to consider on our creation assignments. We've had unlimited amounts of time. And as an artist with an unlimited amount of time, it's very difficult to produce anything because you want to keep going back. You want to keep tweaking. In the art community, in the art world, with your creations, nothing is ever really done. Nothing is ever perfect. You'll always go back and listen to some of the past music you've made and think, I wish I would have done this a little bit different. Or you have a completely different idea, like, wow, instead of transitioning from this to this, I should have transitioned from this to that, just as an example. And so we're going to start to add in the time factor as well. So say specifically in our next creation assignment, maybe you only have 2 hours to come up with something. That's incredibly helpful and incredibly useful in making sure and knowing that there is a finish line, because starting a project like this and knowing that there may not be a finish line can be very overwhelming. And I spent many hour working on this, mainly because I had so many choices and because I knew that I didn't have a time restriction. So I could go through and I could do all the stages. I could try to do a little bit of a mix and try to do a bit of a master on here. And we're going to talk about those things briefly. Don't worry if some of these concepts and ideas are confusing or go over your head for right now. That's fine. All of these things will be covered in due time. So eventually I realized that my approach and goal to this project should be to try and break Bitwig, meaning how hard can I push this program until it just completely crashes beyond repair. And it ended up being a success. I ended up doing that and losing, a good 3, 4, 5 hours of work. I had to go back and kind of start over because I'd gotten to a situation where I had just run too many LFOs into each other and I had it just affecting way too much stuff. And eventually the DSP was spiking and going all over the place. And I had to kind of go back and, try to prevent that from happening again. All right, so we're going to look at my composition. We're going to go through some of the stages, talk about it briefly. And if you have any questions, which you might have in this video, feel free to leave those below. So let's jump inside of Bitwig here and start with this first project file. And as you can tell, we have a few that we're going to go through. So I'm going to go into the other view. Hopefully, if it lets me. There we go. And one thing to mention right off the bat is I decided to start with sound design. If you're not sure what you're going to do or what you want to do, starting with sound design is always the way to go, in my opinion, because as you're building up your sound palette for your track, you're going to start being struck with inspiration. You're going to be starting to understand where you want to go. And that's exactly what happened to me in this particular case. I started out and I just used the E-kick and I decided, okay, let's get some source sounds. And so here were some of the source sounds I was able to come up with. Let's play a few of them. Okay, so really basic, nothing super special. And just by hearing those sounds, I knew I'm not going to be able to really do a whole lot with just those sounds. I'm going to have to run them through a number of processors, and after I run them through a number of processors, I'll have to do it again. So my approach was pretty simple. I was going to use reverb tails, and I know that if I use reverb tails, I'm going to be able to come up with a pretty good soundscape. And so that was where my mind took me. You don't have to do it that way. You definitely don't have to make a soundscape, but for me, that was kind of how those sounds took me in a certain direction. And remember, you could actually make an entire track just creating percussive elements, just creating a few different kick drum varieties, trying to make a few percussion sounds, using some of those falling, crazy pitch effects. And you could just make a really interesting composition just with drum sounds and just building up different forms of percussion. That's not the way I went, but it is a way to go. If that's what inspires you, if that's the path you're taking down, for sure, go ahead and do that. But that wasn't going to be for me. So what I always like to do is resample, get my things down to audio, and delete what I'm not using. So right away, I just bounced these down to audio, and I deleted the E-kick, never to use it again. From that point, I ran these source sounds through a variety of reverbs. I had a low reverb, a mid reverb, and a high reverb. We'll just play one of these through both. Let's see. Okay, so you can hear that. Real exciting. And then we had the high one as well. All right, great. So what you can hear with those long tails is that there's a lot for me to work with. I can go into those tails and I can start to manipulate my sounds and get a variety of sounds to use and to process further. And that's exactly what I did. So if you look here and we look going down vertically, I basically took parts from those tails and I brought them in. I manipulated certain envelopes here, specifically the amplitude envelope. Sometimes I would put these into the repitch mode and change things around. And then for the most part, these became very interesting sounds on their own, even without any effects processing. But I took it that step further and I started to process each of these individually, and I really took them out of control. So just as an example, we'll run through this first example here. And here's what this sounds like without any effects processing at all. All right, I think they're all already turned off, but here's what it sounds like. Okay, so just real basic noise coming through like a low reverb. That's all that is. All right, and then what I decided to do was run this through a variety of effects. I started with this FX chain, just had a compressor, and I put on the character compressor as well. So now we can take a listen. I then added in this LFO, which is controlling a comb filter. All right, so we can hear that little bit of movement. turned up so you can hear it. From there, I ran this into another LFO. This one controlling a resonator bank. And you can see what we have these going to. All right, at that point I ran into a blur just to try to widen things out. So you can hear how that pushes things a little bit more into stereo. And then here's where things really got crazy and fun and experimental. So I ran all of that into an effects layer. And so by doing that, what I have the ability to do is I can process my sound in different ways, in different areas. So I could take the sound, I could make 800 layers, and with each of those layers, I could do something slightly differently. And that's one idea. Just take one sample, one sound, run it through some processors, drop it into an effects layer, and then process each of those layers separately. Now, for me, when I'm making music and specifically making soundscapes, I know that at the end, I'm only going to end up with a few audio tracks. And those audio tracks are going to be separated out. So in this case, we have mid and side. So we have emphasis on the mids, and then we have emphasis on the sides. For some of these, I split it based on frequency spectrum. So low, mid, high. And I think that's really the only thing I did. And that way, when I go to combining all of these different parts, I know, okay, I have all of these lows, I have all of these mids, I have all of these highs. So we can take this a step further, and now we can listen with this back in, and this is just the mids specifically. And obviously I map this here. And now we can take a look. So this is just the mid. Somehow this ended up getting moved. You can see I put the width here down to 0. And then we also have the side information as well. Now, if you listen closely, you'll be able to hear the feedback as well. Okay, so that is just one example. I did that 9 different times with a ton of different variation. Again, this time you can see that we put in a multi-band effects first and we split it out high and low. Again, it's all about your creativity, your imagination, what you want to do with things. And in some cases, you know, I ran LFOs into LFOs and blah, 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 blah. You know, as complex as you want it to be, it's up to you. It's all about getting those particular sounds. Now, from that point forward, I had to have some inspiration for my track. Ultimately, I have kind of a cheesy inspiration. I'm not going to share it with you, but if you go onto SoundCloud and you take a look at that picture and you listen to the frequency that gets emitted at certain points in the track, I think you're going to have a pretty good idea of what my inspiration was. So I'll leave it at that. Moving forward, you can tell we're now at a point where we've done some resampling here. I actually ran into some huge errors at a certain point because after coming up with those 9 different tracks, I also made a variety of effects tracks. Okay, so that I could send everything to these tracks at certain points so I could get consistency from the lows, from the mids, from the highs. So if at certain points in the track I'm able to interject that little bit of familiarity which is coming from these effects tracks, that's what I'm going to do. If that doesn't make sense, let me back up and explain it to you. What I did was I would make my, I had my 9, wow, this is getting confusing even to me. I had my 9 different tracks, okay? I then separated out specifically certain parts. So anything that had mid information, if it was in the low end, so if it was just like the mono stuff and it was low end, I worked with all of that and just kind of grouped it into low end data. So here's just an example of my low end information. Sorry, something else is playing there. All right, so we can hear the variety. And then what I did, just so I could add some intrigue, I took this guy and I sent it pre 100% into the reverb. And so then this is what it sounds like coming through the reverb. Then I sent it through the delay as well, which I had again on an effects track. We're in trouble. We're going to have some crazy feedback effects going on. But basically, inside of these reverbs, inside of these delays, in the filter, and in this 2.82 kilohertz send, which is basically just a resonator emphasizing that frequency, I have a bunch of resonator banks and stuff in here. And with those resonator banks, we're going to get some familiarity as a listener. So if I start to add in a little bit of that reverb on the low end, and then I add a little bit of it in the mids or on the highs, we get that familiarity. And so it all kind of sounds like one composition as compared to just being hodgepodge of sounds and textures, which in and of itself is pretty cool, but maybe a little bit too much for the average listener. So I did this with my low end. I did it with my mids. I did it with my highs. I also ran into a big problem at a certain point. So let me just show you guys quickly. Here is my origins folder. So this has all of the stuff I did. And you're going to notice that like there's a couple of these projects that have like 141 megabytes, 71 megabytes. This isn't including samples. So something obviously went horribly wrong along the way. I expect that inside of my recordings, we're going to have huge files, and we can see that in here, and inside of like exported and inside of bounce, we're going to see a lot of different stuff. But for the file projects themselves, they shouldn't be that big. Basically, I ran into a very serious fatal glitch. It had to do with running multiple LFOs and then using a third-party plugin. I used one of those Klanghelm saturator plugins. I tried to modulate that, and Bitwig just didn't like that. So another day, I tried to open up the project, and it just wouldn't open. So I had to go back and like start over, lost a lot of hours of work on there. But sometimes that will happen, and that was kind of my goal when I set out to do this. So I wasn't super upset about it, but it did happen. I just thought you guys might want to know. I thought I'd show you that to begin with. And one of the things you're going to notice if you start to see your DSP peaking way out, and it actually got a lot higher than this when I was working. And again, I'm not even working with like third-party plugins, just a couple of instances of those Klanghelm things and of that tall tube saturator. And yet still somehow this happened, and at a certain point it peaked all the way out of control. So I knew I had to get in there, I had to delete some of those tracks, and the only way to move forward is to bounce things to audio, delete the track. So that's what I've done here, and you can see we now have like our low-end info, our mid-range, and this is somewhere when we're working on the highs, which I did a little bit differently. So eventually I was able to continue to bounce all of these things down into like more of a final track. So now we have specifically just the low end data here, which is a mix of all of these guys. Take a listen. This also has my mixing tools on here as well. We can just focus on the mid-range. And really, each and every one of these is a pretty interesting composition on its own. The highs as well. You just have to take my word for it, but there is so much going on in each and every one of these tracks. This looks so simple, but this was, tons and tons of hours of work to get it down to this simplicity. If we go back and look at that first track, you have to trust me when I say moving forward along the way, things got more and more complicated. If you look at each and one of these tracks, it looks pretty complex, and really it is pretty complex. And then to bounce it down, to continue to bounce it down to where we get to something as simple as this, it's very rewarding in some ways, but in other ways it's quite deceptive because you don't really get a sense for how much has gone into each and every one of these audio tracks. So last but not least, I went in, I added some mastering here as well. I think this one has some mastering plugins on it. It does. And here's that chain, and we can just listen to the difference. We'll just pick a random point here in the track. turn off the limiter. So listen for detail first. This isn't actually a gain change. This is just trying to add some clarity. And then obviously I added a limiter as well to bring up the level a bit. Okay, at that point, I was done. I exported and I listened back, and there were some problems. There are some points in this track where things cut off. So let's find one of those points. Be ready. This is going to be kind of piercing on your ears. Actually, let's not do that. I'll just go to the final version. I don't want to actually make anyone deaf. So in this very final version, I'd resampled and I had some problems. So I had a click noise here at the end. I also had this weird noise at the very beginning, and I also brought the volume up at the very end just as kind of a last, which didn't happen in the original. So this is basically now the final version. And if I just take this off, this happened to me once before. I'm not sure why this glitch occurs, but basically, if we listen from here, I probably did multiple things to it. You can hear that little pink noise there. That happened to me in another project we did, so I had to make sure I got rid of that. So I went in there, I put a lot of volume automation. There was also a clicking point here, so I had to go in and fix that. And at the end, I just brought up level. The only reason I'm showing this to you is so you can see just how many freaking stages a full project takes. This was a number of different stages of having to go back in, really listen, hear if there's something that's bothering me, fix it, change it, and then bounce to audio and eventually export the final track. So a lot of hours went into this, and what I just want you to realize is that when you have so many choices and when you're going for a full-blown composition, it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of patience, takes a lot of energy, it takes multiple days. So don't think that people just wake up one morning, decide that they want to compose a song, and they're done in 4 hours. It just doesn't happen that way. Nobody is capable of doing that, even if you're just using all presets and pre-made samples. It just is a long process. You kind of have to enjoy that journey and not so much focus on what the result is going to be after 4 hours, because there were many times when I was working on this where after 2 hours, it was like I felt like I was actually moving backwards because I was less happy with the sounds than I was before. But let's go back into the Word document and just wrap things up here quickly. The conclusions for this is, like I just said, this project, like most full projects, took a lot of time, and I do apologize for giving you just so many choices on this creation assignment, because it could have been quite overwhelming, and it was even overwhelming for me at certain points. But contrary to what everyone else says, anyone can make really interesting and engaging music if you just take the time to do so. Okay, everybody is going to tell you, nope, you need this, you need that, you need whatever. If you just have a computer, an Apple iPod Bud headphones, and the Bitwig software, you can make interesting music. So many people get detracted and give up because they don't think they have the right equipment. Remember that that is all a marketing ploy, and it's fine. That's what you'd expect. Will having better monitor speakers help you out down the road? It absolutely will. But is it stopping you from opening up the project and working? It really isn't stopping you from doing that. You can always open it up. You can always work. You can always get better. You can always improve. One of my monitor speakers just freaking broke, so I've had to be working only in headphones. And if I told a mix engineer or a mastering engineer I made this whole thing in headphones, they'd probably be shocked and really angry that I did that, and say, no, that's wrong. That's not the way you're supposed to do it. There is no right or wrong way to do it. You make use of what you have and make the best of it. So in this case, I lost 4 or 5 hours of work. I said, all right, whatever, I'm going to go back and do it again. My monitor speakers are broken. Okay, I'm going to use my headphones. I don't have the latest and greatest plugins. Okay, I'm going to use what I have available to me. And that I really want to stress to you guys, because the more you do this, the more fun you have. When you start to have the resources and availability to add those extra fun things into your studio, it's only going to make you have that much better of a time. But when you're starting out, when you're working on things, don't let not having something detract you from getting in there and creating. And this is true for both experimental and genre-specific music. You can make any genre you want to make with very limited tools if you know how to use them. Again, I emphasize process over product. In this composition for me, that was obviously very, very important because I ran into a number of pitfalls along the way. And I had to remind myself, this is about the process. This is about trying to break Bitwig. This is about trying to do something a little bit different. Not so much about how is this going to sound at the end. And I'm happy enough with how it sounds at the end as well. And I just wanted to kind of mention this now. We'll talk about it, I'm sure, more in later videos. But to me, there's kind of two schools of thought when it comes to making music, specifically computer music inside of a digital audio workstation. The first approach is learn how to make your genre, learn how to make the thing you're interested in. If that's the case, if that's what you're going for, if that's all you care about, that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But my videos are probably not going to be super helpful for you. I'll say it up front. They're not going to be super helpful for you because I'm not going to just go through and say, okay, here's how you make your kick drum for progressive. Here's how you make your kick drum for trance. Here's how you make a hip hop kick drum. What I tend to do is actually method number 2, which is to learn and experiment with just being creative. When you do that, you're going to stumble across everything you need to know in version number 1 or in school of thought number 1. It's fine to be here. It's fine to do this. There's nothing wrong with doing that. I'm not telling you to not do it. But for us, for what we're doing, we are taking path number 2. And what I think is when you take this creative approach, it actually will translate over when you need to start making genre-specific music. So I always like to look at it that way. I like to think that I'm going to be as creative as possible, and I'm going to have to force my creativity to fit into a genre, not the other way around. I don't want the genre to confine me. I want my creativity to ultimately be the thing that pushes me into a certain genre. And as you experiment, as you work with being super creative, you stumble across certain things. You realize, hey, that sounds a lot like a progressive kick drum. Oh, so that's how you make a progressive kick drum, right? I mean, it's things like that. You're going to stumble across the answers. It always just comes back to taking your time, being patient, focusing on the process, and for right now, focusing on being as creative as possible. Because that goes to so many different facets of your life as well. This isn't just specific to making music. I love going into the software and knowing that I have no idea what's going to come out the other end. When I sat down and started this, I had no idea that the track was going to end up like it did. And that's one of the things that I'm really proud of and that I'm really happy about. And I hope you guys can jump in there and maybe have some success doing the same thing. But remember, this is just my approach. These are just some of my philosophies and my ideas. They're not the right ideas. They're just ideas. Okay, and I like to try to share ideas and share knowledge, and hopefully you guys will do the same. So feel free to let me know what you think in the comments. Again, the full version will be available. You can download it. You can listen to it. I'll put it up to SoundCloud. And what I want you to remember, if you do go and listen to that, is he did all of that just starting with the E-kick. Not saying that you should be impressed by it, but just keep that in mind and realize how far we can push this, how far we can go. And if we just are a little bit creative and experimental and don't let rules confine us and guide us in every choice we make, then oftentimes really incredible things will come out on the other end. Thank you so much for watching, and you'll hear from me again in the next lesson. Take care.